Gaslighting transforms reality itself into a weapon, systematically destroying a person's ability to trust their own perceptions and memories. This method was originally identified by psychiatrists working with victims of severe psychological abuse, but its applications extend far beyond personal relationships into the realms of political control and mass manipulation. Gaslighting works by creating a systematic pattern of denying, minimizing, and distorting the victim's experiences until they begin to question their own sanity. The manipulator starts with small contradictions, denying conversations that occurred or claiming events happened differently than the victim remembers. Over time, these denials escalate into complete rewriting of shared experiences, leaving the victim confused and increasingly dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. The technique is named after a 1938 play where a husband systematically convinces his wife she's losing her mind by secretly dimming gas lights while denying that the lighting has changed. This fictional scenario perfectly captures how gaslighting operates in real life. The manipulator has access to information or control over the environment that the victim doesn't, allowing them to create experiences that seem impossible or irrational. What makes gaslighting particularly devastating is that it attacks the foundation of human cognition. Our ability to trust our own perceptions forms the basis for all decision-making and self-confidence. When this foundation is systematically undermined, victims lose their ability to distinguish between truth and fiction, reality and manipulation. They become completely dependent on the manipulator for validation of their experiences and interpretation of events. Clinical studies of gaslighting victims reveal consistent patterns of psychological damage. Subjects report chronic self-doubt, inability to make decisions without external validation, and a persistent feeling that they're somehow fundamentally flawed or incompetent. The damage can persist for years after the manipulation ends, as victims struggle to rebuild their confidence in their own perceptions and judgment. The second technique exploits one of humanity's most fundamental needs through a process called love bombing. This method weaponizes affection, creating an artificial emotional high that renders victims psychologically dependent on their manipulator. The technique was first documented in studies of cult recruitment, where researchers noticed that new members were subjected to overwhelming displays of affection and attention before being gradually isolated and controlled. Love bombing begins with an intense courtship phase, where the manipulator showers their target with excessive attention, gifts, and declarations of love or admiration. This bombardment of positive reinforcement creates powerful neurochemical changes in the victim's brain, flooding them with dopamine and oxytocin that produce feelings of euphoria and attachment. The manipulator carefully studies the victim during this phase, identifying their emotional needs, insecurities, and desires. The crucial element of love bombing is its artificial nature and inevitable withdrawal. Once the victim becomes emotionally dependent on the intense attention, the manipulator begins to gradually reduce their affection and availability. This creates a psychological condition similar to drug withdrawal, where the victim becomes desperate to regain the emotional high they experienced during the initial phase. They begin modifying their behavior, compromising their values, and sacrificing their independence in attempts to restore the manipulator's attention. The withdrawal phase is carefully calibrated to maintain control without completely destroying the relationship. The manipulator provides just enough intermittent reinforcement to keep the victim hoping for a return to the initial phase, while ensuring they never feel secure enough to assert independence. This creates what psychologists call a trauma bond, where the victim becomes addicted to the unpredictable pattern of affection and withdrawal. Research into love bombing reveals that victims often describe feeling like they're living in a constant state of emotional starvation, desperately seeking approval from the person who created their hunger for validation. The technique is particularly effective on individuals who have experienced previous emotional neglect or who have low self-esteem, as they're more likely to interpret the initial bombardment as genuine love rather than manipulation. The third technique represents perhaps the most subtle form of psychological manipulation through a process known as paltering. This method involves telling technical truths while creating completely false impressions, allowing manipulators to maintain plausible deniability while achieving their deceptive goals. Paltering was first systematically studied by researchers examining testimony in legal proceedings, where witnesses could provide technically accurate information while misleading judges and juries. Paltering works by exploiting the human tendency to assume that someone providing factual information is being honest overall. The manipulator selects specific truths that support their desired narrative, while carefully omitting information that would contradict it. Unlike outright lying, paltering allows the manipulator to pass lie detector tests and maintain their reputation for honesty while still achieving deceptive outcomes. The technique is particularly insidious because it weaponizes the victim's trust and reasonable expectations. When someone hears factual information, they naturally assume they're receiving a complete and accurate picture of the situation. Palterers exploit this assumption by providing carefully curated facts that create false impressions without technically lying. If confronted, they can always claim misunderstanding rather than intentional deception. Professional manipulators use paltering in sophisticated ways that can reshape entire organizations or political landscapes. A corporate executive might tell shareholders that profits increased 20%, while failing to mention that this increase came from massive layoffs that will cripple the company's long-term prospects. A politician might cite accurate statistics about economic growth while omitting information about rising inequality or environmental costs. The effectiveness of paltering lies in its exploitation of cognitive shortcuts that humans use to process information efficiently. We rely on trusted sources to provide complete information, and we rarely have the time or resources to independently verify every claim we encounter. Palterers understand these limitations and craft their communications to take advantage of our natural information processing habits. The fourth technique involves a sophisticated form of conditioning known as the foot-in-the-door method. This approach exploits the human desire for consistency, using small commitments to build toward major behavioral changes that victims would never have agreed to initially. The technique was first documented during studies of compliance and persuasion, where researchers discovered that people who agreed to small requests were significantly more likely to comply with larger demands later. The foot-in-the-door technique begins with requests so minor they seem almost impossible to refuse. These initial commitments might involve signing a petition, accepting a free sample, or agreeing to a simple favor that requires minimal effort or sacrifice. The key is that these small actions create a psychological framework where victims begin to see themselves as the type of person who supports the manipulator's cause or helps with their requests. Once the initial commitment is secured, the manipulator leverages this self-perception to make progressively larger demands. Each subsequent request is carefully calibrated to seem like a reasonable next step, from while the previous commitment gradually moving the victim toward behaviors they would have rejected outright if asked initially. The technique works because humans have a powerful drive to maintain consistency between their actions and their self-image. The escalation process can continue for months or years, with each new commitment making it psychologically more difficult for the victim to recognize how far they've moved from their original position. Cult leaders use this technique to gradually separate members from their families, surrender their possessions, and accept increasingly extreme beliefs. Sales professionals use it to move customers from small purchases toward major financial commitments they never intended to make. What makes the foot-in-the-door technique particularly dangerous is that it operates below conscious awareness. Victims don't realize they're being manipulated because each individual request seems reasonable when considered in isolation. They focus on the immediate decision rather than recognizing the pattern of escalating demands that's systematically compromising their autonomy and judgment. These four techniques represent just the beginning of our exploration into the darkest applications of psychological science. Each method has been refined through decades of research and real-world application, proven effective in scenarios where the stakes couldn't be higher. The manipulators who employ these techniques understand that the human mind, for all its remarkable capabilities, contains predictable vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited by those who understand how consciousness really works. The remaining methods we'll examine reveal even more sophisticated approaches to psychological control, techniques that can reshape entire belief systems, destroy relationships, and transfer massive amounts of wealth and power from victims to their manipulators. Understanding these methods isn't comfortable, but it's necessary for anyone who wants to maintain their psychological independence in a world where the weapons of choice are increasingly invisible battles, and they are fought inside the human mind itself. The fifth technique represents a masterpiece of psychological warfare through a process known as negging. This method systematically undermines a person's self-confidence through carefully crafted backhanded compliments and subtle insults disguised as observations. The technique was originally developed by pickup artists, but has since been adopted by manipulators across every sphere of human interaction, from corporate environments to political campaigns, because it exploits one of the most fundamental aspects of human psychology. Negging works by creating cognitive dissonance in the victim's mind. They receive what appears to be positive attention while simultaneously experiencing a decrease in self-worth. The manipulator delivers comments that sound complimentary on the surface, but contain embedded criticisms that target the victim's insecurities. These statements are crafted to be ambiguous enough that the victim can't directly confront them without appearing oversensitive or paranoid. The neurological impact of negging is profound because the human brain processes negative information more thoroughly than positive information. This negativity bias evolved as a survival mechanism, but manipulators exploit it to ensure their subtle criticisms have disproportionate psychological impact. A single, well-placed negative can overshadow hours of genuine compliments, creating lasting doubt in the victim's mind about their worth and capabilities. What makes negging particularly insidious is that it positions the manipulator as someone whose approval becomes increasingly valuable. By subtly suggesting that the victim has flaws or limitations, the manipulator creates artificial scarcity around their acceptance and validation. The victim begins to work harder to earn approval from the person who just criticized them, creating a psychological dependency that the manipulator can exploit indefinitely. Professional manipulators use negging to establish dominance hierarchies in social and professional settings. They might tell a colleague they're surprisingly articulate for someone from their background, or compliment someone's appearance while suggesting it's unusual for their age or social status. These comments serve multiple purposes, undermining the victim's confidence while positioning the manipulator as someone with superior judgment and social standing. The sixth technique involves the systematic destruction of social connections through isolation protocols. This method gradually separates victims from their support networks, making them completely dependent on the manipulator for social interaction, emotional validation, and reality testing. Intelligence agencies develop sophisticated isolation techniques for breaking enemy agents, but the same principles are used by abusive partners, cult leaders, and corporate manipulators who need complete psychological control over their targets. Isolation begins subtly, with the manipulator expressing concern about the victim's relationships with family and friends. They might suggest that certain people are taking advantage of the victim, don't truly understand them, or are somehow holding them back from achieving their potential. These criticisms are carefully crafted to contain elements of truth, making them difficult to dismiss outright, while planting seeds of doubt about previously trusted relationships. The manipulator then creates increasingly compelling reasons why the victim should limit contact with their support network. They might schedule important activities during times when the victim planned to see friends, create emergencies that require immediate attention, or gradually relocate the victim away from their established social connections. Each separation is presented as temporary or necessary, but the cumulative effect is the systematic destruction of the victim's independent social reality. Once isolation is achieved, the manipulator becomes the victim's only source of social feedback and emotional support. This creates total dependency because humans require social interaction for psychological stability and accurate perception of reality. Without outside perspectives to challenge the manipulator's version of events, victims lose their ability to recognize abuse or manipulation. They become trapped in a psychological prison where their captor is also their only companion. The effectiveness of isolation is enhanced by the manipulator's intimate knowledge of the victim's psychology gained during the relationship. They understand exactly which relationships are most important to the victim and which criticisms will be most effective in driving wedges between the victim and their support system. This personalized approach makes the manipulation feel like genuine concern rather than deliberate sabotage. The seventh technique employs weaponized silence through strategic emotional withdrawal. This method transforms communication itself into an instrument of control, using the absence of interaction to create psychological torture that can break down even the strongest personalities. The technique was refined in prisoner of war camps and psychiatric facilities before being adapted for use in personal relationships and organizational settings. The silent treatment works by exploiting humanity's fundamental need for social connection and communication. When someone suddenly stops responding or acknowledging another person, it activates the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. The victim's brain interprets the silence as a threat to their social survival, triggering intense anxiety and desperate attempts to restore communication with the manipulator. What makes this technique particularly cruel is that it provides no opportunity for resolution or understanding. The victim is left to guess what they might have done wrong while being denied the basic human right of explanation or dialogue. This creates a psychological vacuum that the victim's mind desperately tries to fill, leading to obsessive thoughts and increasingly frantic attempts to regain the manipulator's attention and approval. The manipulator carefully controls the duration and intensity of their silence to maximize psychological impact without completely destroying the relationship. They might respond to some communications while ignoring others, creating an intermittent reinforcement schedule that keeps the victim constantly guessing about which behaviors will restore normal interaction. This unpredictability makes the technique even more psychologically devastating. Professional manipulators use strategic silence to establish dominance in negotiations, relationships, and power structures. By withholding communication at crucial moments, they force others to make increasingly desperate concessions to restore dialogue. The technique is particularly effective because it can be disguised as the manipulator needing time to process emotions or think about important decisions, making it difficult for victims to identify the behavior as deliberate abuse. The eighth technique involves the systematic cultivation of fear through controlled exposure to perceived threats. This method exploits the human brain's threat detection system to create psychological states where victims become completely dependent on their manipulator for protection and guidance. The technique has been used throughout history by totalitarian regimes, religious organizations, and individual predators who understand that frightened people make poor decisions and readily surrender autonomy in exchange for promised security. Fear cultivation begins with the identification or creation of legitimate concerns that already exist in the victim's environment. The manipulator then systematically amplifies these fears through selective presentation of information, exaggeration of risks, and constant reminders of potential dangers. They position themselves as uniquely qualified to understand and address these threats, making their guidance seem essential for the victim's survival and well-being. The neurological impact of chronic fear exposure is profound because it impairs the brain's capacity for rational decision-making. When the amygdala is constantly activated by perceived threats, it overwhelms the prefrontal cortex's ability to engage in critical thinking and long-term planning. Victims in this state become highly suggestible and more likely to accept simple solutions from authority figures, even when those solutions require significant personal sacrifices. What makes fear cultivation particularly insidious is that it creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the victim's increasing dependence on the manipulator validates their fears about the outside world. As they become more isolated and dependent, they lose confidence in their ability to navigate challenges independently, making the manipulator's protection seems even more essential. This psychological dependency can persist long after the actual threats have been eliminated. The technique is enhanced by the manipulator's careful control of information flow to the victim. They filter news, communications, and social interactions to ensure the victim receives a steady stream of fear-inducing information while being shielded from contradictory evidence that might challenge their perception of danger. This creates an artificial reality where the manipulator's protection appears to be the only thing standing between the victim and catastrophic harm. These advanced psychological techniques represent centuries of refinement in the science of human manipulation. Each method exploits fundamental aspects of human cognition and emotion that exist in every person, making them universally applicable regardless of intelligence, education, or social status. The manipulators who employ these techniques understand that true power lies not in physical force or obvious coercion, but in the ability to make victims willingly surrender their autonomy while believing they're making free choices. The remaining techniques we'll examine push the boundaries of psychological manipulation even further, revealing methods so sophisticated that victims often become grateful to their manipulators and actively defend the very systems that exploit them. These final approaches demonstrate how psychological warfare has evolved into an art form where the most successful manipulations are those that leave no trace of their existence in the victim's conscious awareness. The ninth technique represents the pinnacle of social manipulation through manufactured consensus and artificial social proof. This method exploits humanity's deep evolutionary programming to follow group behavior, creating false realities where victims willingly adopt beliefs and behaviors they would normally reject simply because they believe everyone else is doing the same. The technique has been perfected by intelligence agencies, marketing corporations, and political movements who understand that humans will abandon their own judgment when presented with overwhelming evidence of social consensus. Manufactured consensus begins with the systematic creation of false indicators that suggest widespread acceptance of the manipulator's desired beliefs or behaviors. This might involve fake testimonials, purchased reviews, artificial social media engagement, or carefully orchestrated public demonstrations that create the illusion of grassroots support. The manipulator ensures these false indicators are highly visible and memorable, taking advantage of the availability heuristic that makes easily recalled examples seem more common than they actually are. The psychological impact of perceived social consensus is profound, because humans evolved in small tribal groups where following the majority was essential for survival. Our brains are hardwired to interpret widespread behavior as safe and appropriate, even when that behavior might be harmful to our individual interests. This evolutionary programming makes us vulnerable to manipulation when artificial consensus is skillfully constructed around us. What makes this technique particularly powerful is its self-reinforcing nature. Once victims begin conforming to the artificially created consensus, they become part of the social proof that convinces others to follow the same path. The manipulator's false reality becomes increasingly real as more people participate in it, creating a momentum that can reshape entire communities or societies without anyone realizing they've been manipulated. Professional manipulators enhance manufactured consensus through strategic use of authority figures and influencers who appear to independently endorse the desired beliefs or behaviors. These endorsements are often purchased or coerced, but they appear genuine to observers who assume that respected figures would only support legitimate causes. The technique becomes even more effective when multiple apparent authorities provide consistent messaging, creating an overwhelming impression of expert consensus. The 10th and most sophisticated technique involves the complete reconstruction of a victim's reality through systematic reality distortion protocols. This method goes beyond simple manipulation to create entirely artificial environments where every piece of information the victim receives has been carefully curated to support the manipulator's desired narrative. The technique was originally developed by totalitarian regimes for prisoner rehabilitation, but has been adapted for use in corporate environments, religious organizations, and personal relationships where complete psychological control is the objective. Reality distortion begins with the systematic control of information sources available to the victim. The manipulator gradually eliminates or discredits alternative perspectives, while positioning themselves as the primary authority on truth and reality. They might restrict access to outside media, discourage relationships with people who hold different views, or systematically undermine the credibility of any information that contradicts their narrative. The construction of artificial reality requires extraordinary attention to detail because any inconsistency can shatter the illusion and reveal the manipulation. The manipulator must anticipate questions, prepare explanations for apparent contradictions, and maintain consistent messaging across all communications. They often employ teams of assistants or collaborators who help maintain the artificial environment and reinforce the desired narrative through multiple channels. What makes reality distortion so devastating is that it attacks the very foundation of human cognition. Our understanding of the world depends on our ability to process information from multiple sources and compare different perspectives to arrive at reasonable conclusions. When this process is systematically corrupted, victims lose their capacity for independent thought and become completely dependent on their manipulator for understanding of basic reality. The technique is enhanced by the manipulator's use of reward and punishment systems that reinforce acceptance of the artificial reality while discouraging questioning or independent investigation. Victims who embrace the manipulator's version of events receive praise, privileges, and social acceptance within the controlled environment. Those who express doubt or ask uncomfortable questions face criticism, isolation, and punishment that gradually conditions them to suppress their natural skepticism. The neurological impact of sustained reality distortion is profound and often permanent. Extended exposure to artificial environments rewires the brain's pattern recognition systems and critical thinking pathways, making victims increasingly unable to distinguish between genuine and manipulated information, even after they escape the controlled environment. Recovery can take years of careful rehabilitation with qualified professionals who understand the specific damage caused by systematic reality manipulation. These 10 techniques represent the most advanced psychological warfare methods ever developed, refined through decades of research and real-world application in scenarios where human freedom and dignity were systematically destroyed. Each method exploits fundamental aspects of human psychology that exist in every person, making them universally applicable regardless of intelligence, education, or social status. The manipulators who employ these techniques understand that true power lies not in obvious coercion, but in the ability to make victims willingly surrender their autonomy while believing they're making free choices. They recognize that the most successful manipulation is that which leaves no trace of its existence in the victim's conscious awareness, creating psychological prisoners who defend their own captivity and even feel grateful to their captors. Understanding these methods isn't about learning to control others, but about recognizing when these techniques are being used against you. In a world where psychological warfare has become the preferred weapon of corporations, politicians, cult leaders, and predators, knowledge of these methods represents your only defense against becoming their victim. The sophistication of modern manipulation techniques means that traditional warning signs are no longer sufficient protection. These methods operate below conscious awareness, exploiting cognitive biases and emotional vulnerabilities that exist in every human mind. They can be deployed gradually over months or years, making them nearly impossible to detect until significant psychological damage has already occurred. Recognition of these techniques requires constant vigilance and a willingness to question your own perceptions and decisions. It demands that you maintain connections with trusted individuals who can provide outside perspectives on your experiences and challenge your assumptions when necessary. Most importantly, it requires accepting the uncomfortable truth that your mind, regardless of how intelligent or educated you believe yourself to be, contains predictable vulnerabilities that skilled manipulators can systematically exploit. The battle for psychological independence is fought every day in conversations, relationships, media consumption, and decision-making processes that seem completely ordinary on the surface. The weapons are invisible, the attacks are subtle, and the casualties often never realize they've been harmed. But for those who understand how these dark psychological techniques operate, this knowledge becomes armor against manipulation and a foundation for genuine freedom in a world where minds have become the ultimate battleground. The techniques we've explored represent only the visible surface of a vast underground network of psychological manipulation that operates throughout every level of modern society. What makes these methods truly terrifying isn't their individual power, but how they combine and amplify each other when deployed by organizations with unlimited resources and decades of refinement. The most sophisticated manipulators never rely on single techniques, but instead orchestrate complex campaigns that attack multiple aspects of human psychology simultaneously. Intelligence agencies have developed integration protocols that layer these techniques in carefully timed sequences designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing detection. A target might first be subjected to manufactured consensus that makes them question their own judgment, followed by isolation that removes alternative perspectives, then gaslighting that destroys their confidence in their own perceptions. Each technique prepares the victim's mind for the next phase of manipulation, creating a psychological cascade that can completely reshape personality and belief systems within months. Corporate manipulation has evolved far beyond traditional advertising into sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns that target entire populations. Marketing departments now employ teams of behavioral psychologists who design consumer experiences that systematically exploit every vulnerability we've discussed. They use negging to make customers feel inadequate about their current possessions, manufactured scarcity to create artificial urgency, and love bombing through personalized attention that makes consumers feel special and understood. The digital age has provided manipulators with unprecedented access to their targets' psychological profiles and real-time behavioral data. Social media platforms track thousands of data points about user behavior, emotional responses, and decision-making patterns, creating detailed psychological maps that can be exploited with surgical precision. Algorithms are designed to identify when users are most vulnerable to manipulation, delivering targeted content at moments when psychological defenses are lowest. Political manipulation has transcended traditional propaganda to become a science of mass psychological conditioning. Modern political campaigns employ teams of data scientists and behavioral psychologists who analyze voting populations with the same precision once reserved for individual therapy patients. They identify specific fears, desires, and cognitive biases within demographic groups, then craft messages designed to trigger predetermined emotional and behavioral responses. The weaponization of social media has created echo chambers that function as massive reality distortion fields, affecting millions of people simultaneously. These platforms use sophisticated algorithms to create artificial consensus by showing users content that reinforces their existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory information. Users believe they're seeing organic social interaction when they're actually experiencing carefully curated information designed to shape their perceptions and behaviors. Religious and ideological organizations have perfected recruitment techniques that combine multiple psychological manipulation methods into comprehensive indoctrination systems. They begin with a love bombing to create emotional dependency, followed by gradual isolation from outside influences, then systematic reality distortion that replaces the victim's original worldview with the organization's ideology. The process is so gradual and sophisticated that victims often describe their indoctrination as personal growth or spiritual awakening. Educational institutions have been infiltrated by manipulation techniques disguised as progressive teaching methods. Students are subjected to manufactured consensus about controversial topics, isolated from alternative perspectives through social pressure and academic penalties, and conditioned to accept authority without question. Critical thinking skills that might protect against manipulation are systematically undermined through emotional reasoning and appeals to social justice that bypass rational analysis. The healthcare industry has adopted manipulation techniques to influence patient behavior and medical decision-making. Doctors use fear cultivation to encourage expensive treatments, manufactured urgency to pressure immediate decisions, and authority-based manipulation to discourage patients from seeking second opinions. Pharmaceutical companies employ sophisticated psychological campaigns that make patients believe they need medications for conditions they never knew they had. Financial institutions have weaponized behavioral psychology to maximize profit extraction from their customers. They use foot-in-the-door techniques to gradually increase debt loads, manufactured scarcity to create investment FOMO, and reality distortion to make complex financial products seem safer than they actually are. Banking algorithms are designed to identify when customers are most vulnerable to financial manipulation, offering credit and investment opportunities at precisely the moments when people are least capable of making rational decisions. The legal system has been compromised by manipulation techniques that influence everything from jury selection to judicial decision-making. Attorneys use sophisticated psychological profiling to identify juror biases and craft presentations designed to trigger predetermined emotional responses. Expert witnesses are trained to use authority-based manipulation and manufactured consensus to make their testimony seem more credible than it actually is. Technology companies have become the most sophisticated manipulators in human history, using behavioral psychology to create addictive products that systematically exploit every aspect of human cognitive vulnerability. They employ variable reward schedules, similar to gambling systems, manufactured social consensus through like and share mechanics, and fear of missing out through constant notifications and updates. Their products are designed to bypass conscious decision-making and create compulsive usage patterns that generate maximum profit from user attention and data. The entertainment industry uses psychological manipulation to influence cultural values and social behaviors on a massive scale. Movies, television shows, and music are crafted using sophisticated understanding of psychological conditioning to normalize specific behaviors, promote particular products, and influence political and social attitudes. The techniques are so subtle that audiences believe they're simply enjoying entertainment when they're actually receiving targeted psychological conditioning. Academic research institutions have been corrupted by manipulation techniques that influence scientific inquiry and knowledge production. Researchers face manufactured consensus about acceptable conclusions, isolation from funding if they pursue unapproved topics, and reality distortion that makes them believe their work is objective when it's actually serving predetermined political and commercial interests. The peer review process has been weaponized to suppress research that contradicts established narratives while promoting studies that support desired conclusions. International relations have been transformed by psychological warfare campaigns that target entire nations' populations. Countries employ sophisticated manipulation techniques to influence foreign elections, destabilize enemy societies, and promote their own geopolitical interests. These campaigns combine manufactured consensus through fake grassroots movements, fear cultivation through terrorist threats and economic instability, and reality distortion through coordinated media campaigns that reshape how entire populations understand global events. The most disturbing aspect of modern psychological manipulation is how it has become normalized and accepted as standard practice across every institution of society. People have become accustomed to being manipulated and even expect it in their interactions with corporations, governments, and organizations. This normalization makes resistance more difficult because victims no longer recognize manipulation as abnormal or harmful behavior. Children are now exposed to sophisticated psychological manipulation from birth through educational systems, entertainment, and social media, designed by teams of behavioral psychologists who understand exactly how developing minds respond to specific stimuli. Entire generations are being raised with compromised psychological defenses, making them more vulnerable to manipulation throughout their adult lives. The convergence of artificial intelligence with psychological manipulation represents the next evolution in mind control technology. AI systems can analyze individual psychological profiles with superhuman accuracy and deploy personalized manipulation campaigns that adapt in real time to the victim's responses. These systems never tire, never make mistakes, and can maintain psychological pressure indefinitely until their targets surrender. Resistance to these techniques requires more than individual awareness because the manipulation systems are now embedded in the fundamental infrastructure of modern civilization. Every institution, every platform, every interaction has been optimized to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and extract compliance from human minds. Breaking free requires coordinated effort from people who understand the scope and sophistication of what they're fighting against. The battle for human psychological independence has already begun, though most people don't realize they're participants. On one side are the manipulators with unlimited resources, advanced technology, and decades of refined techniques. On the other side are individuals armed only with knowledge and the determination to preserve their mental autonomy. The outcome of this battle will determine whether human consciousness remains free or becomes completely enslaved to systems designed to exploit every aspect of human psychology for power and profit. The consolidation of these manipulation techniques into comprehensive control systems represents humanity's entry into an age of total psychological warfare where the battlefield exists entirely within human consciousness. What we're witnessing isn't simply the application of individual techniques, but the systematic construction of manipulation ecosystems designed to capture and control entire populations through coordinated psychological assault. Modern manipulation campaigns operate through what intelligence agencies call layered influence architecture, where multiple techniques are deployed simultaneously across different platforms and timeframes to create inescapable psychological environments. A target corporation might begin by manufacturing consensus through fake reviews and social media campaigns, then escalate to fear cultivation about competitor products, followed by manufactured scarcity around limited time offers, while simultaneously using negging techniques in their advertising to make customers feel inadequate about their current choices. The sophistication of these integrated campaigns means that victims experience what feels like natural social pressure and personal revelation when they're actually being subjected to carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation designed by teams of behavioral scientists working with unlimited budgets and decades of research data. Every interaction, every message, every piece of content has been crafted to exploit specific cognitive vulnerabilities while maintaining plausible deniability about manipulative intent. Technology platforms have evolved beyond simple communication tools into comprehensive psychological manipulation delivery systems that monitor user behavior in real time and adjust their influence techniques based on moment-by-moment analysis of emotional and cognitive states. These systems know when users are tired, stressed, lonely, or making emotional decisions, and they deploy targeted manipulation techniques precisely when psychological defenses are lowest. The integration of artificial intelligence into manipulation systems has created a new category of psychological warfare where human operators design the manipulation frameworks, while AI systems execute thousands of personalized influence campaigns simultaneously. These AI manipulators never sleep, never get distracted, and can maintain consistent psychological pressure on millions of targets while adapting their techniques based on continuous feedback about effectiveness. Corporate manipulation has transcended traditional boundaries to create what researchers call influence conglomerates, where multiple companies coordinate their psychological warfare campaigns to reinforce each other's manipulation objectives. A streaming service might use emotional conditioning to make viewers crave specific products, while social media platforms amplify those desires through manufactured social proof. And financial institutions provide convenient credit options precisely when psychological vulnerability peaks. The weaponization of personal relationships represents perhaps the most insidious development in manipulation technology, where dating applications and social networking platforms are designed to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities in ways that make victims grateful for the manipulation they receive. These platforms create artificial scarcity around human connection while positioning themselves as the solution to loneliness they systematically cultivate. These 10 techniques represent the complete arsenal of psychological warfare that has been systematically hidden from public knowledge because they reveal the terrifying truth about human mental vulnerability. Every person walking the earth today carries the same cognitive architecture that these methods were designed to exploit, making no one truly immune to their influence. The manipulators who perfected these techniques understand that human consciousness, despite all its remarkable capabilities, operates according to predictable patterns that can be hijacked by those who possess the knowledge and willingness to weaponize human psychology itself. The battle for your mind is already underway, and now you possess the knowledge to recognize when these invisible weapons are being deployed against you.